Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text.
Imagine a diagnosis where the only way to, save a patient's vision is to literally blindfold their perfectly healthy eye.
Right. Or a severe, incredibly painful ear infection, where the absolute safest medical intervention is to do absolutely nothing for 3 days.
Yeah, welcome to the totally counterintuitive world of pediatric nursing.
It really is. I mean, it's a specialty that completely flips adult medical logic on its head.
Totally.
In adult care, we like things to be binary, visible, categorized. But in pediatrics, a child's anatomy literally dictates their pathology.
Because they aren't just miniature adults.
Exactly. Their scale, the angle of their bones, the development of their muscles, it changes everything about how a disease presents. And, well, how we have to treat it.
And if you're listening to this right now, chances are you're a nursing student gearing up for the NCLEX, so treat this deep dive as your one-on-one tutoring session.
We're so glad you're here.
Yeah, our mission today is to conquer Chapter 35 of the Saunders Comprehensive Review, which is all about pediatric eye, ear, and throat problems.
And we aren't going to just sit here and memorize lists of symptoms. That's not helpful.
No, not at all. We're going to break down the clinical reasoning, so you understand exactly why certain interventions are the only safe choices for your patient.
Safety is always the priority. Always.
Always. So let's start with the visual system. Specifically, what happens when extraocular muscles fail to coordinate?
Right. So this condition is called strabismus. Colloquially, you'll hear it referred to as a squint or cross-eye.
Okay.
Pathophysiologically, the muscles controlling the eyes are mismatched, either in strength or alignment, which means the brain is receiving two completely different visual messages at the exact same time.
So, if the left eye is looking straight ahead, but the right eye has drifted inward, the brain it doesn't know which image to process, right? It's getting all this overlapping, conflicting data.
Exactly. And the brain is highly adaptable, which, in this specific case, is actually a massive problem.
Wait, why is adaptability a problem here?
Because to avoid double vision, the brain will eventually just start ignoring the visual input from the weaker, misaligned eye entirely.
Oh, wow. It just shuts it off.
Yeah. Over time, this active suppression leads to amblyopia, which is permanent visual loss in that eye. The brain simply forgets how to see out of it.
That's terrifying. So to catch this before it becomes permanent, our assessment relies on tests like the corneal light reflex and the cover-uncover test.
And the 6 cardinal positions of gaze, too.
Right. You're looking for crossed eyes, obviously, but also behavioral cues. Imagine an NCLEX scenario where a daycare nurse notices a child consistently tilting their head to one side while playing.
Or frequently closing one eye just to look at a toy.
Exactly. Those are compensatory mechanisms.
Yeah, the child is physically moving their head to try and align their visual fields because, well, their eye muscles just can't do it. They might also complain of frequent headaches or have really poor depth perception.
Which makes sense. Now, there is a crucial developmental milestone we need to lock in here. A lack of eye coordination is actually considered a normal finding in a young infant. But, and this is a huge, but strictly up to about 4 months of age.
Yes. If it persists past that 4-month mark, it requires immediate intervention.
And regarding that intervention, I've always found the occlusion therapy protocol so bizarre, it feels like a trick question.
I know exactly what you mean.
We are trying to fix the weak eye, but the text says the standard practice is to place a patch over the good eye. Why on earth wouldn't we patch the bad one?
It feels completely backward until you look at the actual mechanics of muscle building. It's like having 2 cameras pointing in slightly different directions.
Okay,
right?
I'm with you.
By covering the healthy eye, you are completely removing it from the visual equation. The brain is starved for visual input, so it is forced to rely on the weak, affected eye.
Ah, so it forces those weak extraocular muscles to work much harder.
Exactly. They have to carry the entire visual load. It essentially acts as physical therapy for the eye, strengthening those muscles and preventing that permanent brain suppression.
You literally force the weak eye to do all the heavy lifting. That's brilliant. Okay, so while strabismus is a structural alignment issue, conjunctivitis, or pink eye, is a severe inflammatory issue of the conjunctiva.
Right, and this is usually caused by an allergy, an infection, or trauma. The assessment cues are classic, itching, burning, scratchy eyelids, redness, edema, discharge.
But the clinical reasoning shifts entirely depending on the underlying cause, right? if it's bacterial or viral, those secretions are extremely contagious.
Highly contagious.
Yeah.
Let's test this logic in a patient education scenario.
Yeah.
If a parent tells you that they are letting their infected child share towels and washcloths with their siblings because they've started eye drops.
Oh, absolutely not. You have to step in immediately.
Right. Bacterial conjunctivitis spreads like wildfire through shared linens. Strict infection control means separate towels, aggressive hand washing, and ensuring the tip of the eye drop bottle never physically touches the eyelid or lashes.
And don't forget, you need to advise older pediatric patients to throw away their old contact lenses and eye makeup.
Yes. Otherwise, they will just reinfect themselves the very next day.
Now, regarding medications, the text breaks this down by type. Viral conjunctivitis usually resolves on its own in 7 to 14 days.
And remember, antibiotics do absolutely nothing for a virus. Antivirals are reserved exclusively for severe vision-threatening cases like herpes simplex or varicella zoster.
Right. Bacterial cases, on the other hand, often get topical antibiotics to shorten the infection window and reduce the spread.
And allergic conjunctivitis is treated by just removing the environmental allergen and using antihistamines.
But there is a massive safety alert in the chapter regarding one specific type of bacterial infection, chlamydial conjunctivitis.
This is such a critical point for patient advocacy. Chlamydia is a sexually transmitted bacteria. Now, it can be transmitted vertically during childbirth to a neonate.
Right, from the mother.
But seeing a chlamydial eye infection in an older, non-sexually active child, that is a major red flag.
Wait, so if you see that in a toddler?
If you encounter this in practice or, on an exam, clinical reasoning demands that the child be assessed for possible sexual abuse. You have to investigate further.
Wow. You protect the patient first, always.
Always.
Okay, so that connects the anatomy of the eye. But just as eye-muscle coordination changes as a child grows, the physical structure of a child's ear directly makes them more vulnerable to our next topic.
Otitis media, middle ear infections.
Right. And I have to ask, why does it seem like every toddler gets ear infections, but adults rarely do?
It all comes down to the architecture of the eustachian tube. That's the tube that connects the middle ear to the back of the throat.
Okay.
In adults, this tube is angled downward, so gravity just naturally pulls fluid and secretions away from the ear. But in infants and young children, their eustachian tube is shorter, wider, and much straighter.
So it's essentially a horizontal tube. Gravity isn't helping at all.
Precisely. Because it's horizontal, normal drainage is blocked. And this anatomical quirk becomes a huge liability right after an acute respiratory infection, like RSV, the flu, or group A strep.
Because the respiratory infection causes the eustachian tube to swell shut, right?
Exactly. The fluid builds up behind the eardrum with nowhere to go. It creates the perfect warm, dark environment for bacteria to breed. And there you have otitis media.
So to prevent this horizontal pooling, the text emphasizes upright feeding for infants, right? To stop milk and reflux from flowing directly into those straight tubes.
Yes. You also want to maintain routine immunizations and keep the child away from secondhand tobacco smoke.
Oh, because the smoke paralyzes the tiny cilia that helps sweep fluid out of the ear.
Exactly. Now, when fluid is trapped, the pressure builds significantly. The child will present with acute ear pain, fever, crying, loss of appetite.
You'll probably see them rolling their head from side to side or aggressively pulling and rubbing at their ear, trying to relieve that pressure.
Yeah, and if you look inside with an otoscope, you'll see a tympanic membrane that is red, bulging, and immobile.
So for interventions, we want to encourage fluid intake and provide local heat or cold. But there's a really unique intervention here regarding diet.
The chewing restriction.
Yes. The text says to avoid chewing, which makes total sense if you think about it. Just like you wouldn't walk on a sprained ankle, you shouldn't chew with an infected middle ear.
Right, because every time a child chews solid food, the jaw movement grinds against that inflamed ear canal. It rests the inflamed jaw-ear connection if you don't chew.
So the clinical protocol dictates a strict, soft diet. And you administer analgesics for the pain and fever.
But, and this is a big NCLEX safety tip, never irrigate the ear with normal saline in this situation.
Oh, right. Pushing fluid into a system that is already inflamed and under pressure is totally unsafe.
It will only exacerbate the pain. Now, regarding antibiotics for otitis media, the chapter provides very specific pharmacology guidance.
The wait-and-see approach.
Yes. In healthy infants older than 6 months, and in older children, waiting up to 72 hours for spontaneous resolution is often the safest management.
Which is another one of those counterintuitive pediatric things. The text says we do this to prevent breeding medication-resistant streptococcus pneumonia.
Exactly. If the child's immune system can clear it on its own, we let it. But if antibiotics are prescribed after that window, parent education is paramount.
They have to administer the antibiotics for the full course, not just until the child feels better and not just until the fever drops.
The full course. Every time.
Now, contrast that middle ear fluid with otitis externa. This is inflammation of the external auditory canal.
Also known as swimmer's ear.
Right. With swimmer's ear, you see a rapid onset of symptoms, ear pain, itching, fullness. But what's the key assessment finding that differentiates an outer ear infection from a middle ear infection?
It's the pull test. If you manipulate the pinna, the outer cartilage, and the tragus, the child will experience severe tenderness.
If you pull on the outer ear and the patient screams, suspect otitis externa.
Yeah. And treating this brings us to a massive NCLEX medication administration rule for topical antibiotic drops.
Oh, I know this one. How you manipulate the ear depends entirely on the child's age.
Right. An infant's ear canal is naturally directed somewhat upward. So to straighten the canal for drops in a child under 3 years old, you pull the earlobe down and back.
Under 3, down and back.
But as the skull grows, the facial bones shift and the canal angles downward. So for a child over 3 years old, you pull the pinna up and back.
Over 3, up and back. Lock that in, everyone. Now, what if those internal middle ear infections become a chronic issue? The surgical intervention is a laryngotomy, right?
Yes. This involves making a tiny surgical incision into the tympanic membrane to insert tympanoplasty tubes for drainage. They're basically tiny pressure release valves.
And post-op priorities are all about keeping the surgical site dry.
Exactly. The child must wear earplugs while bathing or swimming, absolutely no diving. And parents need to enforce a strict rule. No nose blowing for 7 to 10 days after surgery.
Because blowing the nose forces air up the eustachian tube and can actually dislodge the tubes.
Right. And speaking of dislodging, parent education is vital regarding the tubes themselves. Inform them that these tiny white spool-shaped tubes will fall out spontaneously.
Usually in like 6 to 12 months, right?
Yeah. If a parent sees a tiny white spool sitting on their kid's pillowcase one morning, it is not a medical emergency. They should just notify the provider so it can be documented.
Okay, so fluid trapped in the ear is fundamentally a pressure issue. But as we move down to the throat and nose, inflammation rapidly turns into a highly critical airway and bleeding issue.
This is high stakes. Tonsillitis and adenoiditis. These are masses of lymphoid tissue in the pharynx and nasopharynx, often caused by group A strep or mononucleosis.
And because a pediatric airway is already incredibly narrow, enlarged tonsils take up vital real estate. It causes obstructive sleep apnea, mouth breathing, and a nasal quality of speech.
If a tonsillectomy is required to surgically remove them, our preoperative priorities shift heavily to vascular safety. The throat is an incredibly vascular bed of tissue.
So assessing the patient's bleeding and clotting studies preoperatively is essential.
Absolutely. The prothrombin time, or PT, is your most significant pre-op lab value. You have to know the blood's ability to clot. You also assess for any loose teeth, which pose a severe aspiration risk when the airway is instrumented.
Makes sense. Once a child is out of surgery, we enter heavily tested NCLEX territory, the take action safety interventions. Let's break this down.
Okay.
Let's say a child begins vomiting bright red blood shortly after waking up. What is the initial action?
Positioning. You immediately turn the child to a side-lying or prone position to facilitate drainage and prevent aspiration. Right. Safety first, airway first. Then you notify the provider.
Right. And you also must have suction equipment available. But the text is very clear on this. Do not suction unless there is a clear active airway obstruction.
Routine suctioning is incredibly dangerous here. Pushing a catheter blindly into a freshly operated throat causes severe trauma to the surgical site. It will likely trigger a massive hemorrhage.
Okay, so if we can't look back there easily, how do we spot bleeding if the wound is hidden in the throat?
The absolute classic assessment cue is frequent swallowing or continuous clearing of the throat.
Because they're reflexively swallowing the blood pooling in the back of their pharynx.
Yes. You also assess for signs of shock, like a fast, thready pulse.
Now, what about dietary restrictions? The text says clear, cool, non-citrus fluids. So a cherry popsicle or red Jell-O is fine because it's cool and clear, right?
Yep, absolutely not.
Wait, really?
You must firmly avoid red, purple, or brown liquids entirely, because if the child vomits, those food colorings perfectly simulate the appearance of blood. You won't be able to differentiate if they are hemorrhaging or if they just threw up a cherry popsicle.
Oh, wow. That is such a vital clinical nuance.
It completely masks your most critical safety indicator. You also want to avoid milk and pudding initially. They coat the throat, which prompts the child to clear their throat, and that risks bleeding. And obviously, no straws or sharp objects.
Moving from the throat to the nose, we encounter epistaxis, or nosebleeds.
Very common, usually from trauma or mucosal inflammation.
And the old school advice was always to tilt your head back, right?
Which is the absolute worst thing you can do. The clinical judgment box in the chapter outlines strict safety steps. By tilting back, you funnel blood directly down the airway.
Aspiration risk.
Huge risk. The correct protocol is to remain calm, sit the child up, and lean forward. This ensures blood drains out of the nose. Then apply continuous pressure with your thumb and forefinger for at least 10 minutes.
Lean forward, not back. Got it. Finally, let's touch on allergic rhinitis. This is sensitization to environmental allergens.
You'll see itchy, watery eyes, clear nasal drainage, but look for allergic shiners, dark circles under the eyes from venous congestion, and cobblestoning of the conjunctiva.
Interventions are just allergy testing, avoiding triggers, antihistamines, and nasal corticosteroids.
Right.
Okay, so now that we've mastered the foundational concepts and interventions, it is time to put this clinical reasoning to the test, exactly as the chapter does. Let's tackle the practice questions.
Let's do it. We need to review the logic behind these questions and teach you how to eliminate unsafe or lower priority options.
Starting with the tonsillectomy bleeding questions 1, 4, 5, 6, and 7. They walk through the scenario of a child vomiting bright red blood post-op.
And remember the strategic word initial. The initial action is always to turn the child to the side to prevent aspiration. Then notify the provider.
And that's why prothrombin time is the most significant pre-op lab. We also saw a question about a prescription to suction every 2 hours. We know to question that because it causes trauma.
Exactly, and reiterating that frequent swallowing and a fast, thready pulse are signs of bleeding and shock.
Moving to conjunctivitis, questions 2 and 3. These use a negative query, asking what statement needs further teaching.
Right, so you're looking for the incorrect statement. The option about sharing towels is the wrong action because bacterial conjunctivitis is highly contagious. That parent needs further teaching.
And don't forget the chlamydia and sexual abuse connection we discussed earlier. Now, otitis media, questions 8 and 10. These focus heavy on pharmacology teaching.
Parents must administer antibiotics for the full course, not just until the fever drops.
The soft diet option is correct because it reduces pain from chewing. But one option suggests irrigating the ear with normal saline.
Which we know is an incorrect, unsafe option because it exacerbates the inflammation.
Exactly. And finally, the strabismus question number 9.
That one just reiterates the assessment cue of a child consistently tilting their head to see.
So if you summarize the reasoning here, every correct answer in these practice questions stems directly from the safety and foundational anatomy principles we just discussed.
100%. If you know why the anatomy works the way it does, the angle of the eustachian tube, the vascularity of the tonsils, you can deduce the safest clinical action every single time.
It's all about how pediatric nursing is entirely shaped by the unique scale of a child's body.
It really is.
I mean, think about it. A millimeter of swelling in a tiny pediatric airway, or the specific angle of a eustachian tube, or the heavy vascularity of a really small throat, it completely changes the priority of care compared to an adult.
Recognizing those anatomical differences isn't just a pediatric fun fact. It is the direct driver of patient safety. And honestly, NCLEX success.
Absolutely. Well, from the Last Minute Lecture team, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We are incredibly proud of the hard work you're putting in, and we wish you the absolute best of luck on your NCLEX journey. You've got this.